also want to say thank you very much to my partner, Patricia, who's here with me today. She's my biggest support, my biggest fan. I'm her biggest fan, and she's helped me with my presentations, etc. And so I'm just so glad to have her along here today as well. So let's get started and see what we can learn about Santorini. So we're going to talk a little bit about geology, a little archaeology, some mythology, and then a little history as we go through the presentation today. It's really going to be a sort of a wide view of Santorini, its history, how it came to be, and what it is today. So if you look at this picture, this is a picture from Nassau. It is of the island itself. And one of the things is that this island was almost completely blown off the face of the earth by a volcanic eruption that happened about 1700 years BC. So it's amazing that this island is even standing. And it was also what was believed to be the end of civilization, the civilization known as the Minoans. And we're going to talk about that, what that civilization was like, maybe what happened to them, and what we did gain or learn from that civilization. The other question becomes is, could this be the lost city of Atlantis? Is this where the story comes from? Because very much so what happened on Santorini was there was an active village of the Minoans, a very advanced society for its time, one of the most advanced societies at that time, it's believed, one of the original cradles of civilization today, there on Crete. So is this the story that Plato does know about, that he has talked about as Atlantis? Or is Atlantis just mythology? So we'll investigate that a little bit today and see if we can have some fun with that. So this explosion, or the volcanic eruption itself, was the largest in known human history. And what I mean by that is that there were larger explosions prior to man being on the planet, but this was the largest volcanic eruption known since man has been on the planet. So imagine the size. It would have been some 10 times the size of Mount St. Helens, or 10 times the size even of Vesuvius, which was just outside of Naples, which we'll learn about in a future talk. So these circles, they represent the 10-time-fold growth. So just imagine on how big that eruption would have been compared to what we're familiar with, such as Mount St. Helens. Because there's St. Helens at just under 5, and there's Santorini at a 6. And that's a 10-fold increase by number, much like on the earthquake scale. What you see there in the center, this is what's called the caldera, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. But what you see here in the center is the growth of the new volcano, the new dome. So it is still an active volcano, and from Santorini you'll be able to visit it if you wish to. And I think occasionally there is steam that's visible above the volcano. So caldera, that comes from the word cauldron. And that's what it's describing here. So this is an enormous caldera. It's the largest one that we're aware of recent explosions. And you can imagine that the total area that that volcano would have taken up would have been a large mountain filling that entire space. So when this eruption happened, imagine how much volume of material was thrown into the atmosphere, and then how the caldera or the mantle then collapsed back into the sea. Again, bringing up questions of, could that be Atlantis? So I talked about the new dome there that's forming. So coming back to Atlantis, so Plato's original story was in 360 BC, and is it real or was it parable? Now we know that Plato often made up parables to try and help and teach society to have good morals. And he did that through story. However, in this case, many people believe that there could possibly have been an Atlantis, and he had real information. However, the story, according to Plato, was also 9,000 years older and came from Egyptian priests. And it was passed down to his grandfather, I believe, is what the story goes. Now, the other thing about the island, though, is it does have a round shape. And part of the story of Atlantis is that the city was round. So that gives another plus towards, oh, this could possibly be Atlantis. Here what we're showing are the Pillars of Hercules. So on the Strait of Gibraltar, which we're not passing through, but I think most people here would know the Strait of Gibraltar is between the Atlantic and entering into the Mediterranean. And the story, Plato's story about Atlantis, is that it was just past the Pillars of Hercules. And this is on one side of the Strait of Gibraltar. Now in Spain, there is some evidence close to the strait where they have found some ruins. However, further investigation and further digs hasn't really turned up any kind of large-scale city or large-scale civilization that may have been lost as it would have been Atlantis. So we have a plus minus here where it's close to the pillars, but there's not enough evidence there yet. The other question becomes that the story of Atlantis is that the city collapsed into the sea. It was flooded, there was earthquake, volcanoes, and it collapsed into the sea. So the question becomes, was there a lot of building originally on the old dome before it collapsed into the sea? Because that would be, again, keeping in light with the story itself of Atlantis. So we'll investigate that a little further. And what we're going to talk about is the civilization, the Minoans, who were virtually eliminated by this cataclysmic event. And we're going to talk a little bit about who they were and how advanced they were as a society. So this here is a picture of the current Akrotiri, which is known as the Pompeii of Greece. So on the island of Santorini, there is this archaeological site. It's under about 2 hectares of roof. And this archaeological site is the ancient site of Akrotiri, which was the Minoan civilization. Now, what's interesting about the site in particular is that this was a site that they believe was buried in about 1700 BC, but that most of what they've been turning up is very advanced, and more advanced than they've discovered of any other civilizations to date. This would be the same civilization of Knossos found on Crete. So there are buildings that are as much as 4 stories high. They're painted, decorated. There are sewers, indoor toilets even. Imagine that in 1700 BC. There were vibrantly colored floors. The buildings themselves were beautified with mosaics. The walls were all finished. So these are practically modern dwellings for the time. So the Minoans, pictured here, is a mosaic that was taken, I think, from Knossos on Crete. Who were they? So as I said, the original find was on Knossos, on Crete. And they're named for the legendary King Minos, the son of Zeus, who gained throne from the aid of Poseidon, is the story. The reason I'm telling you this is because this little bit of information may become important when we talk again about whether or not this could be potentially the lost city of Atlantis. And it's considered to be the first advanced civilization in Europe. And in fact, Knossos on Crete is said to possibly be the oldest city ever in Europe. So we really are currently sailing through the cradle of Western civilization right now. So again, we talked about the fact that they had large and well-decorated and well-constructed living quarters and buildings. This particular mosaic is interesting, and I'm going to point this out a couple times. You can see here that these are pieces and fragments. So these were the amount of fragments that were actually found, and what they did is they put this together as a puzzle. You can see the various fragments that they've put in. And then they painted in the rest of the area. Artists recreated what they believed would have been the entire picture. I think it's fascinating what scientists and artists can do with this sort of thing. But it goes to show you how you take a few pieces of something and expand on it, and you can really get a picture of what the society was doing and what it was like. They were the first society that we know of to have a written language. My understanding is that we've yet to truly decipher it yet, but it is what we believe to be the first written language in Europe. And of course, they had complicated and complex infrastructure. I mean, certainly nothing like this cruise ship, but imagine indoor plumbing 1700 years before Christ. Quite a feat. And they did sophisticated art. In other words, they were well past the drawings of cavemen in caves. You're going to see a lot of the other art that I'm going to portray here, and you'll see that they focused a lot on the natural beauty, flowers, everyday life. Culturally advanced. One of the clues, again, of this is something like this particular mosaic, where there seems to be some sort of chalice or some sort of ceremony happening between two people. Or maybe they're just having a cocktail like the rest of us. It's possible. And leisure time. So when ancient cultures are found to have leisure time, in other words, they've been able to develop themselves to the point where they have the sustenance they need, they're not struggling every day to make life happen, they're able to create better structures, prettier, decorated structures to live in. They're able to work on things like math and science and continue to learn and grow and create actual culture. So the leisure time of this particular group is very important to recognize. So here we are again, a picture. We've got Crete down here in the bottom. We've got Santorini, and that shows where its position is in the Aegean Sea. Now, one of the things about Santorini, it goes by many names, but one of the original names was Strongly, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. So Strongly apparently in Greek means round shape. Again, that brings up the question as to, in the story of Plato, the claim was that the lost city Atlantis had a round shape. This is the island group here is known as the Cyclades, where a number of finds have been discovered for other Minoan artifacts, etc. Again, this mosaic was found at Knossos on Crete, but I wanted to point it out because I just absolutely think that it's a brilliant and beautiful piece of artwork. Once again, you see all the broken pieces that were recovered. And this was put together as a puzzle. And then artists filled in the gaps based on all these pieces and the positions they were in. I think that's, personally, I find that astounding. And the one thing I look at is I go, well, I can't imagine putting together a 200-piece puzzle. Imagine putting something like this together and then having to fill in all the gaps that you have. Again, it shows to the level of their sophistication in art. Now this is a picture of, well, it's not, well, this is a picture of a wall, but this is an actual wall that was removed from one of the buildings at Akrotiri. And what is important about the find on Santorini, more so they think, well, as important as Knossos on Crete, is that here on Santorini, because it was buried for the length of time that it was, that would have been almost 4,000 years, under the volcanic ash and rock, that it was incredibly well preserved. So the pieces of these findings here on Santorini are much larger. And in fact, these are almost completely intact mosaics. These are displayed at the Museum of Prehistoric in Thera, located in Fira. If it was something you were interested in doing, that museum apparently is just a wonderful place to visit. And the other thing about the Minoans is that their art depicted primarily everyday life. What you see here, they call this on the end boys boxing. So it's apparently of sport at the time. So even again in leisure time, you have time to develop sport. And the rest of their depictions are often of fauna, the natural beauty of the outdoor world. Here's another view, and you can see what the scientists here have done and the archaeologists is they've actually left some material in place so that you can get an idea of what it is that they're finding, where they're finding it, how intact it is. And as you can see, there's a walkway that you can actually take a tour through the site. And it's just about apparently 15 minutes from the village of Fira. Again, buildings that were as much as 4 stories high, vibrantly colored floors. They were painted and decorated, sewers and indoor toilets. This is an intact wall inside the site. What is astounding about this is, of course, you can still see the colors that were on the building at the time. So they had time to decorate, to make things pretty. This is 2 floors of what they believe was a 4-story building. You can see that the building itself has architectural features. You can see this feature here that was put up as an architectural feature when the building was built. The wood around the doors and windows for finishing. And there's a final beautifying layer that was put over the stone and rock that was used. It's not unlike how we might build today with brick and then put a finishing stucco coat on. So a truly advanced build and design. So far, they've uncovered about 40 buildings. The real thrust to the archaeological dig happened in 1967 by Spiridon Marinatos. Again, if my pronunciations are poor, let me know later. Or not at all, actually. No, I'm kidding. I should learn to pronounce these names properly. The first signs, how they discovered this dig, is very much how a lot of the archaeological sites are accidentally discovered. In the 1800s, they were collecting pumice to add to cement when they were building the Suez Canal. And it was when they were excavating the pumice that they started to come across the archaeological site. Since that time, there have been different individuals that have gone in and become the scientists that have developed the dig, but like I say, the primary development was by Spiridon Marinatos in '67. Again, I'm fascinated by this. This is a almost fully intact room that was fully decorated. Again, the depiction of flowers, everyday life, vibrant colors. So Knossos, I think I mentioned that it's referred to as Europe's oldest city. So again, the Minoans are considered to be, if not the first, one of the first European civilizations. But that then speaks to how old Akrotiri is, because it would have been developing at the same time. So Akrotiri is they believe that there were human activity on Akrotiri since about 4,000 years before Christ, and that the event that ended the Minoan civilization happened in about 1700 BC. This is, again, a simple depiction of everyday life. The Minoans were, with their art, were primarily concerned with everyday life, of beauty. Not necessarily painting pictures of conquests or wars, which many other cultures did. So we believe that they didn't really have a warring culture within the group. What I do find interesting is that the hairstyle is somewhat similar to what we might see today. Just saying. Here we have a picture of the current archaeological site of the 40 buildings that have been discovered so far, and they're expecting that this will expand to 3 times the size still, because of how much they're finding. The city itself was very well organized. Large streets with small streets beside, large streets for commerce, small streets for neighborhoods, and being more quiet. But what they also noticed with the buildings is that some were being reinforced, where they were putting timbers inside the buildings to try and give it some reinforcement. And there was also evidence of repair. And what that suggests is that there may have been earthquakes happening prior to the big eruption. Again, the type of things that they found there were very suggestive of a prosperous society. This is a cast pour of a table. They called this an offering table. So imagine that when the archaeologists started first digging, they would have come into a cavity. So what they started doing in the cavities is, instead of completely removing what was there, is that they would pour in plaster. And the plaster would then cast into something like this table. And so when you go to Naples, you'll learn that about Pompeii too. A lot of the archaeologists did that there as well. So they discovered that by doing that, they were getting a better picture of what their furniture looked like. So this would have likely been a piece of wood furniture that would have been buried in ash. The wood itself would have completely decomposed, left a perfect cast imprint that we were able to refill. And to me, this says sophistication. This looks like something out of France in the 15 or 1600s. They also found items from Egypt and Greece and from the mainland. So there was obviously a lot of travel. They obviously had good commerce and were prosperous because of their perfect location in the Aegean Sea at that time. This is a small gold figurine that was found. I just find it fascinating. I can't say I know much of the story around it, but it was found in one of the homes in Akrotiri. Here's some more artwork. This is a jug. Again, they tended to decorate with things like the natural beauty or the natural elements around them. This is just a simple jug with a bird on it. And here we have a jug with 2 little breasts. So even then there was some obsession, but we'll skip over that. Again, part of the natural beauty. Here we have what to me looks a bit like a dolphin that has been painted onto a jug. And these are completely intact pieces that have been recovered from Akrotiri and are at the museum. Now, the other thing about this society, and one of the reasons why they feel it was very advanced and was very able to to have leisure time, etc., is that they raised livestock for milk and meat. And they cultivated grapes for wine and a multitude of other crops, such as grains, vegetables. They decorated their homes outside with plants and flowers and gardens. So I think it's astounding to see what a society or a culture could have done in that period of time, some almost 2,000 years before Christ. Now, unlike Pompeii, there were very few skeletal remains found. In other words, they believe that the majority of the people were able to evacuate or to escape. And when you tie that in with the previous couple of slides about the fact that they found damage to the buildings that were being repaired because they believe that was from earthquakes, so they think that they had good indication that it was time to pack up and leave. So it's believed that the majority of the people did get off the island alive. However, imagine the size of a tsunami that would be created from that kind of a volcanic eruption. So did a tsunami overtake them? Because we know that from that event forward, we see them going into decline and eventually disappearing, and they're not really sure where they would have ended up. I mean, here's a typical depiction of what an eruption looks like. But again, this eruption would have been so large that it would have easily sent ash, pumice, rock, dust, some 20 miles into the sky. Professor Sinolakis, scientist from Crete, who has studied the culture and studied the local area a great deal, he would have estimated that the tsunami would have been at minimum 12 meters high, which is about 40 feet. And of course, in those days, all the villages would have been coastal, so virtually everybody would have been affected by the tsunami in some way or another, either pulled back out to sea, or their homes destroyed, their livestock lost, their farms eradicated. So the question also becomes, well, if that's not the event that ended them, then what happened? So with an event that large, there'd be so much debris in the atmosphere that we would have what's called a volcanic winter. And a volcanic winter happens when all that ash stays in the atmosphere for a long period of time and reduces the amount of sunlight that's able to come through. So it is very possible that there was a long volcanic winter that lasted for years that would have caused very wet summers, poor crops, crop loss, just would have made life extremely difficult, and they would have been back in a survival mode. So they'd come from a leisure back to a survival mode, trying to get through the following 4 or 5 years that would have followed the event. So the escape was likely, but no good evidence of where they went. Or was it Poseidon? Right? So here we go with the mythology is, if this was the famed city of Atlantis, was Poseidon, who is the god of sea, water, and earthquakes, did he feel that the people who were losing their morality and that it was time to teach them a lesson or eliminate them to make room for the next society? Now, following that event, Santorini was unpopulated, of course, for centuries. But slowly, other cultures started to show up and repopulate the island. You had the Phoenicians, the Dorians, the Romans, and the Byzantines. So throughout the next, from about the time of Christ forward, is when the population started to come back to Santorini. So it took some 1,000 years for the island to redevelop start growing plants again, etc., following that amazing eruption. What you see here, this is an ancient Roman theater. It is available for visit. It's a roadside attraction, basically, which is hard to imagine, but it's there. This comes from about 200 BC. So this would have been when the Romans were able to come to the island and start to populate it. And of course, these types of theaters would have served also as the gathering place for the town itself. So if they had business to do together, or if there was an art event happening, etc., these theaters would have been used for those purposes. What's interesting about Santorini is that for the next 2,000 years, the island went through different cultures came, like I said, Dorians, some from mainland Greece, Romans and Byzantines, and there was an ebb and flow of who ran the island, etc. There was even a period of time, I think it was the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, where the Venetians, who had a great deal of power in those days, controlled the island. So it was a very sought after holding because of its position, unique in the Cyclades Islands and in the Aegean, because it was a perfect stopping off point for seafarers. And in 1800s, something that's very interesting about it, in 1800s, the Ottoman Empire, who are now the Turks, the Ottoman Empire had the strongest, largest navy in Santorini on this side of the Mediterranean. So although in the 1800s there would have been the French, the English, etc. on the west side, the Ottomans had the largest navy here from Santorini on the east side. Again, there's a great picture of Greece. And so finally, Santorini became part of Greece in about the turn of the century. For the next 40 years or so, it was primarily an agricultural based economy, very small population, but they were starting to do well. They had some unique products, we'll talk about that. But unfortunately then came World War II, and they were occupied first by the Italians and then by the Germans, so it took them quite a while to start to recover from that. In 1956 there was an earthquake that unfortunately damaged virtually all of the buildings on the island, and the majority of the population then left one more time. But since then, tourism started to come back in the 70s. And the population has continued to grow since then, and it has become one of the most desirable places to vacation. So it's amazing to see how the island has had to be reborn multiple times and learn to try and find out what is the next thing that's going to be prosperous for the island and the people. Here's a Greek flag, and one of the reasons I'm showing that is because it's the traditional blue and white. One of the reasons why the houses on Santorini and in a lot of Greek locale are white and blue is that because somewhere in the 60s, the government was a military government, and they wanted everybody to paint their homes in the traditional patriotic colors of white and blue. There is also the fact that there's, in the 30s, there was a color outbreak. And what it was believed that whitewash, which is the white paint that they started using in those years, had limestone in it, and that the limestone would offer some disinfectant qualities. So again, the government of the 30s decided that everybody should be whitewashing their homes for health reasons. But the most practical thing about painting your home white when you're under the sun is that it reduces the amount of heat that the home absorbs. So it's really, keeping them white is a practical solution. And as you can see here, in most places in Santorini, almost everybody has a view. This is one of the beaches in Santorini that reminds me of something out of a 50s movie, just because of the way that it is at the bottom of a sheer cliff and is isolated. So the beaches on Santorini are really quite well known. They're quite famous worldwide, primarily because of their beauty and the clarity of the water. They're not known to have a very fine sand, and very often the sand is of a dark color. So if you're planning on going to a beach on Santorini, there are dozens. Try and inform and find out which ones you want to go to. Some have beach clubs, some have lighter colored sand, but this one here is amazing with its red sand colored area. And that, of course, is because it's the result of the volcanic geology. There's a black sand beach. One of the other things too, if you want to see really clear water, apparently the beaches that are pebble beaches have the most clarity. Now, talking a little bit about its current agriculture. This is the darling of Santorini for the wine lovers. So we're going to switch it over a little bit here into the leisure that we're going to enjoy here in Santorini. So the wine grape is known as Assyrtiko. It's got an incredible story. The one thing about the soil on Santorini is that because it's volcanic, there is virtually no clay in the soil. And because there's no clay in the soil, there's very little opportunity for any microbes or bugs, etc., to cause any root damage, rot, or any kind of blight. So the grapes that are currently grown there are original from what the Minoans were growing 4,000 years ago. So there's very, very little change. So when you sip a glass of wine on Santorini, you are sipping a little bit of history. And the Vinsanto wine, although they have a half a dozen varieties of grapes that they grow, this particular variety is then taken and dried in the sun and turned into a sweet wine, a dessert wine. It's well known throughout the world. So if you were going to try a glass of wine on Santorini, that's certainly the go-to. It's the Darling. Now what's fascinating again is that you've got a landscape that just really isn't ideal for growing grapes. So how they've developed a way to try and protect the grape and grow them is what you see here, what looks like a basket, and what looks like a bunch of roots is exactly that. So what they have to do is they slowly train the vines to grow in a round circle, continuously training them to grow into a basket-like shape so that the grapes can grow inside the basket and it protects them from the constant wind and some of the harsh sun. So this has been their agricultural development for this particular grape. And you'll see these lined up in a row, and they could easily be mistaken as just some local bush. But as you're walking around Santorini tomorrow, when you see one of these, you'll know exactly then what it is. And the vines, as I said, that there's very little bacteria in the soil, these vines, most of them, are 50 to 75 years old, which is unheard of in any other culture where grape vines would typically be producing as well at that age. Now, I just put this up for fun because what I wanted to do was talk about the fact that during the Ottoman Empire, when they controlled Santorini, this wine was so well loved that, of course, in their culture, drinking was prohibited, the manufacture of alcohol was prohibited, but they allowed the people of Santorini to go on making the wine because there was such demand for it in different parts of the world because it was so well loved, and it gave them a very strong source of revenue at the time. And just one final point about that wine is that it was enjoyed by the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church adapted it in Russia. But unfortunately, in the early 1900s, there was a government decree that said, no, you can't buy that wine from that locale any longer. So what happened is, again, Santorini, when it had developed a good agricultural base, it lost it virtually overnight from the loss of that customer in Russia, the Orthodox Church. So they had to switch to other agricultural crops. And this particular cherry tomato is another item that is 100% unique to Santorini. It was born there, and it's one of the few places that it will grow. And it's another thing that if you're on the island, it's something that we're told that if you're going to taste some of the local produce, try that cherry tomato. Churches. Almost impossible to talk about anywhere in this part of the world without talking about churches. So the first church on Santorini was one that was called Saint Irene. And the connection of it, and the reason why we've got the name Santorini is because it is a contraction of Santa and Irene, which the name of an early Christian basilica, and therefore it became known as Santorini. So that's where today's name comes from, about 800 years after Christ, because of that first basilica. This particular picture is of the oldest functioning church, and it was built in the 11th century and is still open today. Yeah, this is the church of, I believe it's St. John. Yeah, this is the church of St. John the Baptist Cathedral on Santorini, built in 1823. So it was damaged by the 56 earthquake, but it has been completely rebuilt and restored. The use of colors are absolutely astronomical. Again, a place that's very well worth visiting. And this is the Three Bells of Thera. So built on a site that once housed a temple that was built into a cave in the wall. The current church was built in 1757. It too was damaged by the earthquake, but it too was rebuilt to its original status. About the churches on Santorini. So Santorini, there are different reports out there, but apparently there were over 400 churches on an island that only has about 15 or 16,000 permanent residents. But why this is that a lot of them are just small chapels, and they were often built by families to face the sea in order to give hope and faith to those that were going out to sea and fishing, etc. So, so that's how we ended up with 400 plus churches on such a tiny little island that's only about 18 kilometers long by about 5 kilometers wide. Now, what did the Greeks bring us? They brought us democracy. The concept of democracy was first created by Greeks of having a vote of your peers to decide on who was going to lead. Of course, they brought us the modern Olympics and modern sport. Theater, dramas, comedies, the very concept of what we're doing here today is something that the Greeks gave us culturally. The Greek alphabet, virtually all Western languages use the majority of the Greek alphabet. And the concept of medicine. Hippocrates was the first individual that put out the idea that disease, that sickness was not a spiritual failing, or that it wasn't some sort of evil spirit that had entered the body. He was the first one to say, no, there is a natural cause of some sort where the body is either an organ is failing or that some sort of disease has entered the body, not an evil spirit. So the Hippocratic Oath, of course, comes from Hippocrates, and we still teach today in our schools for doctors and nurses about the morality that they should hold when they are helping patients. And the jury of our peers concept. So justice by jury rather than by decree or by one individual. However, trial by jury was up to 500 individuals, and they did this on purpose in order to make sure that there was less possibility of corruption, of course, because it still existed. But imagine how long it would take 500 jurors to make a decision. Aqueducts. So we think the Romans may have come up with the aqueducts, but there's, again, evidence on Akrotiri and other Minoan sites that maybe it was the Greeks that first came up with aqueducts. The two main cities, or towns, if you wish, on Santorini are Fira, the capital, and Ia. Fira is a little busier, Ia is a little quieter, a little more romantic, but both cities give an incredible opportunity for these types of picturesque views, etc. Now, just to wrap things up here, I talked at the beginning about the fact that this could be the lost city of Atlantis. We talked about the fact that it collapsed into the sea. One of the things is there's a scientist currently who's using sonar, and she's mapping the sea floor around the caldera to look for evidence, and she is seeing evidence of man-made structures. So, was there a collapse of a large society into the sea? Is this the true location of Atlantis? I'll leave that up to you guys to decide for yourselves. So thank you for coming today. My understanding is that they'll leave the theater for something else that's coming up shortly, and thank you very much. But if anybody wanted to